undoubtedly you do have communication between men who felt that at a time they were linked in a way by a value, in the case of the Legion, this kind of warrior elitism, that somehow transcends national identity and survives intact in some degree, even if former Legionnaires end up on different sides trying to kill each other.
NATO official says civilians, you and I, must prepare for all-out war with Russia within the next 20 years. Admiral Rob Bauer has urged governments to build infrastructure and even prepare for conscription. One of the considerations here is how well support for Ukraine is lasting. Is there fatigue setting in well and truly now across Europe and indeed in the US? The conflict in Ukraine is approaching its second anniversary. And in today's Times, a fascinating profile of the combatants who'd served in the French Foreign Legion. Formerly brothers in arms, they're now on different sides and fighting each other. That's the piece by Anthony Loyd, senior foreign correspondent for The Times, who joins us. Good morning, Anthony.
Callum, good morning.
It's so good to speak to you about this because it is utterly fascinating, the French Foreign Legion. Tell us first of all about the makeup of the French Foreign Legion. Who's in it? How long has it existed? And crucially, what's its role in this conflict?
So the French Foreign Legion was formed in 1831, and it's currently got about 9,000 soldiers in it who serve in the French military. These are guys drawn from about 140 different nations, and they're molded together and unified by that kind of regimental identity, the identity of the corps, and this martial elan, this martial elitism, and the history of the Legion, which transcends national identities. You know, it's very famous in history. I'm sure many of the listeners will have read Beaugest and be quite aware of Legion exploits across the years. However, currently, or up until the Russian invasion, there were a very large number of Ukrainians and Russians in the Legion. There are about 700 Ukrainians and probably about 450 Russians. At the start of the current phase of the conflict here, the general in charge of the Legion addressed legionnaires to say, look, remember your fidelity to the Legion, and exhorted them not to go and desert, because he was obviously worried that a lot of Ukrainians would go back and fight in Ukraine and that perhaps some Russians would go and fight on the Russian side. And that's exactly what happened. An undisclosed number of Ukrainians and apparently some Russians went back to their respective homelands to fight against each other across the lines. And they were joined by a lot of former legionnaires too, men of different nationalities. And the legionnaire I spoke to, former legionnaire, was in fact a Frenchman who had joined the Legion. He had to convert his nationhood to being Swiss under the terms of contract for French who wished to join. And he told me of his own life and times in Ukraine, but also of the way this weird bonded brotherhood of the Legion had been divided by the war amongst those who either deserted to go and fight or had already completed their service and went back to fight in Ukraine.
Mm. And that is the kind of fascinating twist in the reporting that you've done today, Anthony. There's a great picture in the article of Frank in his kind of combat gear, holding his weapon aloft with a sort of camouflage hat on as well. But the underpinning thing in all of this is his outlook, his thoughts. I suppose that glimpse into the psychology of how he, among others, is now having to fight people with whom he used to stand alongside.
Yeah, and Frank had no problem with this, and he understood that the other side would have no problem in trying to kill him either. He said, you know, the days basically in which we were united, those were days in the past. This is the reality now. If I came face to face with them, talking about his former comrades in arms fighting on the Russian side, I would try to kill them, and I would expect them to do exactly the same to me. However, some parts of that bonding identity still remain. And I think what was most interesting for me as I was researching the story and speaking to people was to come across a video clip of a dead young Ukrainian French Foreign Legionnaire called Yevgeny Kulik. He was 23 years old. He deserted the French Foreign Legion at the start of the conflict in Ukraine to come back and fight in his homeland against the Russians. Now, he was killed at the edge of Bakhmut last year. And the next thing Prigozhin, who was then the chief of the Wagner Group in Russia, put out a weird message on Telegram saying, we've been contacted by members of the Foreign Legion looking for a dead legionnaire, and we have found the body of Yevgeny Kulik. This video then followed, which was of Kulik's body in a coffin and a Russian fighter addressing him very respectfully in French. The intimation was that the Russian fighter had himself been in the Legion. Before the Russian pulled out the Legion flag and, addressing Kulik's corpse, he draped the flag over the coffin, said, we have fought in many of the same battlefields, but now we send our legionnaire back to his home. And the suggestion was that one dead legionnaire fighting on one side was being given a respectful send-off by another former legionnaire fighting on the other. And it's an extremely poignant video. Kulik's body was indeed returned to the Ukrainians, and he was buried outside his home in Poltava.
So this kind of emphasises that actually between these kind of different armies, really, or different groups of combatants, there's some sort of communication and almost it's the sort of principles of war and, in inverted commas, the rules of war really fascinate me, because it's something that soldiers really acknowledge and adhere to. So even in the monstrosity that is war, there are some things that actually supersede that, and this sort of respectful request on the body of a dead person being returned is one such thing.
Was such an illogical and absurd entity. And yet here, undoubtedly, you do have communication between men who felt that at a time they were linked in a way by a value, in the case of the Legion, this kind of warrior elitism, that somehow transcends national identity and survives intact in some degree, even if former legionnaires end up on different sides trying to kill each other.
It's astonishing. Anthony, it is brilliant to speak to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Callum.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Speak soon. That's Anthony Loyd, who is senior foreign correspondent for The Times. And his article, Russian fighters were once my brothers in arms, now I'm on a mission to kill them. It's in the World section today. You see pictures of Frank, among others, and you kind of get to grips with, as I say, the utterly, I have to say, baffling psychology of soldiers in terms of how they fight, how they kind of flip their brains into, well, now I'm fighting against people that I used to stand alongside. And indeed that element there, the kind of communication between different groups of soldiers in order that they can kind of liaise on things like the return of those who have been killed in action. It is utterly gripping.
And Anthony Loyd, he not only writes beautifully, but the people he finds, the stories he uncovers, the access he gets is quite incredible. He reminds me very much like Christina Lamb as well.
Yeah.
The proper journalists who go out and find people and uncover great stories that are often very troubling, but give us a real insight into the realities that people are living around the world right now.